Adam, can you? All right, go ahead and take it away.
All right, we're going to convene the meeting, the work session meeting for November 12th, 2024. I believe the mayor is excused this evening. And we will start with roll call.
Commissioner Adam Marl. Here. It looks like we have an audio issue, but I did see that you were present. Commissioner Frank O'Donnell.
Here.
Commissioner Mike Mitchell.
Here.
Commissioner Rocky Smith.
Here.
And Mayor Denise is excused tonight.
All right, we'll move on to future agenda items. Tony?
Thanks. So next Wednesday, November 20th, from 6 to 7, we'll revisit the adaptive reuse program that's been discussed. On December 10th, we're holding that for a potential interview with Planning Commission applicants. Right now, I think we only have one. Oh, we have two now. Okay, so we do have two.
And how many positions?
Two.
Two? Okay.
Yes. We also may try to do that before the meeting on the 4th. We'll just see where times work out for folks. And then the Destination Marketing Management Organization update will be on December 10th. Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, so we have two general business items. The first is local street volume review, and I believe that is Kula Hurd-Ravitch and Community Development Director.
Yeah.
And the company.
Over here. Do you guys want us to sit or? Yeah, up around the table. Okay.
Stay away from
Sorry, that's okay. You're just in time, actually.
Sorry.
Sorry. Oh, well, now I feel separate from everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. It's okay. It's Mike's fault.
Yeah, it's my fault. I'm trying to stay away from Frank. That's the idea.
Okay. Is there a... There you go. Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you. So I'm here with three other folks to bring you this update. So Carrie Richter, our Deputy City Attorney, and Josh Wheeler, our Assistant City Engineer, and Christina Robertson-Gardner, our Senior Planner. We each have kind of a piece of this at this moment, so we're going to present to you in pieces here. So this topic came up over the summer, and I don't have a super long presentation. It shouldn't be anyway. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, so this topic came up over the summer because as the city continues to grow, we see increases in population and growth through development, and then there's more concerns about traffic impacts to local streets. And a local street's actually a road classification. It's the lowest classification, meaning that local streets are designed to carry the least amount of traffic. And then it goes collector, arterial, and there's some in between. But a local road is supposed to connect you to a collector street. They typically provide connections to the wider streets, which is a collector. And over the summer, staff was asked to evaluate the benefits and concerns of implementing a volume standard. And so we had our consulting traffic engineer, Rhea Flisikowski from DKS, present an initial analysis. And at that time, the commission gave us some direction for what you wanted to hear next. And so we looked at how other cities that we had evaluated, we looked at how they implemented their guidelines and then how we could strengthen our traffic calming program. And so we're going to go over some of the findings that we found along with just kind of a legal analysis review. And then we've got some discussion questions, and then if there's some general agreement, we can proceed with direction if that's where you want to go tonight. Okay, so in August, we presented a memo that's in your packet tonight, and that highlighted the background of what local streets do, their standards. It gave a summary of guidelines and standards in our peer communities and potential benefits and challenges to implementing local street volume. And in the conclusion, they offered two options. One was implement a maximum daily volume standard. I don't know why that's a mouthful to say, maximum daily volume standard, or strengthen existing traffic management strategies. And so the direction that we got at the time was to find out how our peer cities and communities were actually implementing their guidelines, and then to bring back information about our traffic calming program. So we're going to present that to you tonight, but first we kind of wanted to set the stage in terms of what we can reasonably do and what is reasonably defensible. And so that's where Carrie comes in. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to Carrie, and she can walk through some of the points from her memo.
Sure. When we regulate traffic, as you know, we have projected that our roads have to be a certain size and have certain amenities, and when an applicant comes, we evaluate the number of trips that are proposed, and if the proposal triggers a level of service increase necessity, then we ask them to build a street light, or we ask them to build an additional lane consistent with our transportation system plan. And what this would do would add another layer to that, right? It would say that this local street has a high volume, and so we need some traffic calming measures to be put on that street in order to slow traffic down and hopefully deter pass-through traffic from using those roads and staying on collectors, right? If you can add enough traffic calming measures, then cars will make other choices. But right now, our TSP doesn't have any of that evaluation, doesn't have any of that data. So if we were going to regulate traffic calming measures on local streets, we'd have to collect that data to know what we need. And we have a TSP update on the horizon in the near future, so that could be done. Short of that, we have limitations in that if we're going to regulate traffic calming measures, we have to have standards and criteria requiring those measures in our code. So we would have to amend our code in order to identify, in a site plan design review application, for example, we say every building has to have a certain amount of windows. Well, in any building of a certain size that generates a certain number of trips, you have to install 2 traffic calming measures from this menu. I mean, that's what a sort of clear and objective obligation would be, assuming that we know what if we're going to do this in a clear and objective way. So we need standards and criteria, then you got to be in the code, and then we've got the same constraint about rough proportionality, right? We can't impose on a single house an obligation to install traffic calming measures on a long length of a local street, because that wouldn't be roughly proportional to the impacts of their development, right? So those are the legal constraints that we're working within. I think that what Aquila and Josh's research came up with is that other local governments have guidelines about traffic calming measures, and those guidelines might be informative and they might encourage a developer to implement them, but we couldn't regulate them if they're not standards and criteria. So that might be a good way to sort of test the waters, see how it's working, maybe do a pilot program or something like that, to have developers, when they do a traffic impact study, which is what they perform when they file an application, they could evaluate what the nearby local street usage is, and then add theirs, and then perhaps have a discussion with Public Works about traffic calming, and if they were willing to install those improvements, then, you know, we could test it out. So that might be a sort of middle ground way to sort of get this off the ground if you wanted to move immediately, short of the whole study of inventory of local streets and amending the TSP and going forward with regulations. That might be a middle ground. I don't know what else is on the slide that I didn't cover.
I think you covered it. I mean, the two options are basically either codify it with standards or go through the TSP. I don't know that it's really an alternative. I feel like if we put something in the code, then we need the TSP anyway, because we're gonna need that kind of backup and policy direction of why we're doing this regulation. So, okay, we can keep going. All right, and so this is Christina's
I'll do my
slide.
best to either read that way or turn around. But, so I reached out to all the peer cities that were in Rhea's original memo from the summer, and actually I just was able to connect up with Kaiser this week, and they didn't provide any additional information. So I was able to reach out to all those communities, and what I heard for the folks that don't have guidelines as part of their process, and I'm speaking in relation to land use decisions. So you could have guidelines in your TSP as more of a planning document, or thinking about how you want to ensure that there's enough neighborhood collectors, or in this area of local streets, should one be a neighborhood collector in like a long-range planning. Kind of my conversations with peer cities were related to land use applications and how the intersection of these guidelines would relate to a review of a development proposal. So the one key thing I heard back is not one city used the guideline to condition a denial of an application, or a trip cap, or conditions related to street calming. So the closest city that did that was McMinnville. They had a type 3, so a more discretionary decision of a master plan, and they were looking at potentially doing a phase capping of a development, but they ended up, for legal reasons, not moving through. So far there was not a direct connection for land use and local volume guidelines that I heard from communities. Actually, sometimes there was ping-ponging back from Public Works to planning, because they weren't used to it. It was not a concept that they used on a daily basis. I did hear from a couple jurisdictions that didn't have it that actually would have really liked it, because when there is a controversial land use application, and maybe there's a neighborhood with a dead-end street that was never supposed to be dead-end, and they're connecting, and the development proposal provides additional trips that are well below any kind of regional standard of a guideline, it's another metric to show that, yes, these streets were meant to connect. This is working as intended as a local street. So some jurisdictions thought it would be helpful in that way as an educational tool, that these are two local streets that are connecting and acting as planned. The question, let's see what else is next. So the discussion of mitigation related to streets calming was not one that any jurisdiction was currently working on. I did actually hear some questions, how would that be implemented? One jurisdiction asked, are you adopting specific street calming projects, like on the TSP, like a city map of street calming projects that have already been kind of pre-vetted? So if I'm a neighbor and there's a development happening, I may not want that street calming project. Maybe that's a condition, but maybe I don't want speed bumps, or I don't want, a chicane, direction. Maybe I don't want the implementation of the street calming in my subdivision. If you put street calming on just the new subdivision, is it actually providing the intended purpose, which is to ensure that people are utilizing neighborhood collectors. So there was a really question of how is that implemented so people feel that the street calming is a benefit and is expected if a land use application came through. I think one thing that came out of the conversations that I hadn't thought about was kind of implication of as we update our TSP. In 2013, when we adopted our TSP, we actually declassified a fair amount of neighborhood collectors, like peas, I think Pearl maybe. There was a fair amount, especially in the southwest area of the city. And the reason for that was kind of a desire not to overbuild our neighborhood collectors. So maybe you might have a neighborhood collector that might have the volume, but it still looks like a local street. And so in that 2013 way we were viewing it, which is we don't want to overbuild bigger streets than we need. So if we are looking at adopting a volume in a TSP update, we need to look at those streets because we may need to readopt those as neighborhood collectors, which don't have a volume, right? Because we want people to use neighborhood collectors to get to get to minor arterials and then get to other parts of the city. So I think that would definitely be a work plan item in a new TSP update is, A, do we have the right location and number of neighborhood collectors? And if we don't want them to be overbuilt, maybe we at least need to identify them as they're going to be functioning as bringing more than just local trip traffic. Let's see. I think that's pretty much what I heard. This is something that no other jurisdiction is really looking at, is linking local street volume to traffic calming to land use applications. So I didn't have in this jurisdiction they do this, and we can look at them, but so I haven't really seen that. So whatever we do will need to be, the right decision for us, and we can't copy anybody.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, I'll hand you the clicker because
I have multiple slides.
Yeah.
One comment just briefly with what Carrie said. Trips are what we're talking about here. And just trips are obtained every 3 years. We do traffic counts every 3 years. They're typically on collectors and arterials, so we do not necessarily have trips for all local roads because typically traffic counts are done for collectors and arterials. So that would be a change too. If we would need to understand certain local roads, what their volumes are, we would have to measure it. That was not in my presentation, so I wanted to make sure that was added. So you did already hear some information about traffic calming from RIA back in August, but what we're trying to provide here is more detail. And maybe even a few levels deeper. So first we're going to kind of talk about the types of traffic calming that exist in the nation. We're also going to talk about that we've been using the word traffic calming. What was the one that you used a minute ago? Local street volume, traffic capacity. But there's also a difference in those terms to traffic diversion and traffic safety. And so one thing people may think is a traffic calming situation would be a rapid flashing beacon, an RRFB, which helps you with those crosswalks. But those are more safety related and don't really change the capacity or the calming effect, although it does do calming during that blinking time. So just know there are some differences there, and you're going to hear that certain alternatives are beneficial for certain types of things, but not all types of things with respect to volumes and calming and safety. And then once I go through that, I'm going to say what kind of things we have done as a city in recent years, and some things that we might be able to do that we haven't done yet. And then we're going to go over a little bit of what's next, and then go into further discussion of what's next. So a lot of this is geared towards if you had a capital program of some sort, and we're able to find a way to fund that, these are some ideas that you would have. So if you go to the FHWA website or type in traffic calming FHWA, you'll find something called Traffic Calming Primer, which is a huge document that gives you all these different ideas, more than the ones even shown here. I believe there's 22 different ones. I've consolidated them to make them all similar. You'll see them listed there. I'm not going to go through each one, but I am going to go through the ones that are maybe less well known. So the first one I'm going to go through is a road diet. A road diet means you're taking a 3-lane road and taking it down to a 2-lane road. That has happened in some cities. That maybe they add parking on the sides, maybe they add bike lanes and get rid of a center lane. That narrowing effect actually reduces speeds most of the time, and sometimes makes people divert their traffic because they don't want to be there anymore. That works better on collectors and arterials, not necessarily local roads in a city of our size. Traffic circles versus roundabouts. A lot of people like to call roundabouts traffic circles. They are completely different things. They have completely different standards. A roundabout is like what you see at Maple Lane and Walnut Grove that was just built, as well as over on Clackamas River Drive as part of the 213 realignment project, the jug handle project. A traffic circle is something that I know you see in the city of Portland, or at least I have seen in the city of Portland, where it's normally a string of small circles, sometimes even planters, that you put in the middle of the intersection to try and create a slowing down, a blockage feel, and it does make you go slower. But there are negatives to that, which I'll go into in a second. You'll hear a lot of terms like speed bumps, speed humps, speed tables, and speed cushions. They're all different, but they're all the same. A speed bump is really that small, very direct, if you hit it, you're gonna blow a tire bump. That sort of bump, right? A speed hump is much broader, much wider, and is used in more areas that you're gonna expect, possibly school buses or emergency vehicles, where they can travel them, but they would prefer not to. And so a speed cushion is the same exact thing, but you've got the wheel paths cut through. Those are called speed cushions, quite often for fire truck reasons. And then speed tables are those that are at an intersection and are lifted with a very flat top to it, but they do have a lift to them. And we actually have one of those that I'll show in a minute. Christina used the word chicane. Another word for that could also be choker. That is where you're taking a 2-lane road and you're making it so that the only way to get through is 1 lane at one point. Sometimes that's by using extra islands. Sometimes that's narrowing the throat of the road at the intersection. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And then the last one I'll go over is a diagonal diverter. I've never personally seen them, but they are ones where you take a 4-legged intersection and you make it into only being able to go 2 directions. What used to be go north-south, you now go north into the east, or you're coming south into the west, but you're getting rid of that cut through there, and that's another thing that's been done at some intersections throughout the nation. And just for reference, in the picture here, you're seeing a center island on Malala on the left, and then on the right, you're seeing a painted intersection, which is at 11th and Jefferson, if I remember right. What things have we done in Oregon City? Again, the pictures I'm showing here are, that's a curb bump out on Main Street at, I believe, 13th Street. And then what you're seeing on the right is a flashing sign, which is at the corner of Holcomb going westbound towards Redland Road. Other things that we have done here are speed bumps. Our speed bump program, there's an application that people fill out. There needs to be neighborhood buy-in. They have to meet certain criteria to be considered it acceptable to have a speed bump. And then if they want the speed bump, they pay for it and we install it and then maintain it for the life of the speed bump. Another thing that we put in are mirrors. Those are usually done at blind corner sort of areas. They're often requested by citizens, but if there's no crash data that says there's been any accidents there, if the citizen wants to fund it, we will install it. If there has been crash data, then we put it up at our own cost. That's our program there. Roundabouts I already mentioned, so you've seen a couple of those go in. There are others that are proposed by the TSP. Our block length standard, that's something that you'll see as a a traffic calming device. The whole purpose of block length standards is to make it so that you don't have someone driving multiple blocks before they have the chance to turn left or right. You want them to be able to turn as many times as they can. And so our block length standard, we do not allow blocks to be larger than 530 feet as of the code today. That's fairly in line with most municipalities. They're somewhere in that 500 to 600 range. There are cases where maybe that's not possible, or there's cases in the city where that hasn't happened yet, but the plan is for that to happen as development occurs in those areas that it doesn't exist. Speed table, I'm going to show that in a minute, but that's over at Gaffney Lane. That's what we put there. It's not as table-oriented as one would expect, and we really kept it down because of the buses there. But I've heard good feedback that that has worked well for the kids and the pedestrians there. I talked about the curb extensions, and we have one more over here at High Street that was put in the last 5 years. That's at 6th and High, and that one was put in so that we could kind of mirror what's already happening on the street, and it did not exist before, and that creates kind of a slowing feel as well. It makes it feel more constrained, and so people slow down when they see those. It also allows a pedestrian more of a refuge area to not have as long to walk across. That's the other reason they exist. In fact, the one on Main Street was a grant-funded project, and because it helped ADA. This project here was done out of PMUF. It was a project of opportunity. But what you're going to hear throughout this is projects have either been funded by grants or they've been projects of opportunity to join another project. We've not done any individual solo projects that are traffic calming related. One thing you want to note about curb extensions is they are always used at intersections. That's the only place they're used. But they do remove street parking. That's their negative. Raised crossing, as I said, at Gaffney. These are done at intersections. Typically, they're used for pedestrian crossings and either at high pedestrian levels or potentially like school areas. That's where you're trying to create this feel that everyone needs to slow down, everyone needs to have a safe place to cross. But if you elevate it too much, it can be a problem for buses or emergency vehicles. So that's why that one is much less elevated. Traffic circles I mentioned a minute ago, you really need to make sure that they're in a line. If you just put one in, it doesn't divert a lot of traffic, but as soon as you put multiple ones in, 2, 3, 4, throughout multiple intersections, it really helps with that traffic calming feel, slows people down. It really works well on local roads, but you want to make sure that there aren't massive trucks that you plan on being on that road, have enough room for those fire trucks to come through, and it is more challenging for maintenance and sweeping. Center diversions, you saw the picture earlier of Malala. This is one on Glen Oak. I don't know how the one on Glen Oak got put in. I'm sure some of you may, but the one on Malala, that whole idea of having a center median or a center diversion is to calm people down. It slows people down. It creates more vegetation. It creates the ability to not have a track to go through, a racetrack in that case. It does create additional maintenance with the landscaping and making sure there's not weeds and making sure it's beautiful for the area. They don't often create traffic diversion. They usually just slow things, but usually not a volume change. Pavement markings is something that one of our neighbor cities does, Happy Valley. They're often done on rural roads or roads that don't have curbs. I could see this potentially used on places like Holcomb or Anchor Way, South End, maybe Myers, even though that will be urbanized over time at some point. They're really good to direct people's attention. These are 3 examples of ones throughout the nation. The one on the upper left is a similar type style that's over on Happy Valley Road on Idleman Road there. Quite often they're used at curves to slow people coming into a curve. They tend to be more safety related. They do tend to not hold up over time. Not only from a maintenance perspective, they're a maintenance challenge, but people get used to them and ignore them after a while. So that's the downside of pavement markings. The city of Spokane, actually has a traffic calming program. Most of their program is related to painted intersections and improved pedestrian crossings, so things like those speed tables or bump outs. And they put X amount of money in each year to do specialty projects for that, and that's how they do that. And so lastly, as I said, we implement traffic calming through opportunities, projects of opportunity, or a special grant project. Usually has to be safety related. The TSP does look for options like these during the update, but typically on collectors and arterials, not local roads. So that would be something new that would have to be incorporated as part of the TSP process update, which is expected in the next couple of years. If a program was created, Public Works recommends that we would have to create some sort of list, some criteria for that list. You know, where do you start, where you go first, prioritizing that list, and then funding it. Current funding is not currently increasing on the transportation side of things. The gas tax has kind of flattened out for us. It's went down for people like ODOT in Portland. And our vehicle registration fee has actually went down some. Our revenue's not going up, and our costs are obviously going up. They're increasing as they always do. And so the one thing that we want to make sure you're aware of is if it's something you wanted to implement, at this point we would probably have to cut something elsewhere. And so maybe that means less sidewalk infill, maybe reducing the sidewalk reimbursement program, maybe cutting or delaying a project like 213 New Beaver Creek, or extension of Holly Lane. You know, something would have to be cut to bring in the new program, or a different revenue source would have to be brought in. And that's what we have there. I think we go back to Quilla.
Yeah, thanks. So we put some discussion questions in just to kind of give you a jumping off point. I think the one takeaway that we got out of this is that we could look at some volume guidelines that go into the TSP for the local roads other than the collectors and arterials. And that might be a place to start. And as I mentioned before, we should have some kind of policy guidance in there anyway if we're going to look at putting in criteria in the code. And there's just considerations to take into account for pros and cons of traffic calming, who pays for it, who maintains it. Sometimes it sounds like a good idea and then it goes in and the neighbors don't actually like it anymore. So there's just some kind of trade-offs there. And that's some of the stuff that we just need to think through and could be part of the TSP discussion. But so that's kind of where we wanted to leave it, is just open it up for your discussion. And then if you arrive at a point that you want to provide direction, we would need some kind of direction to move forward with. And that is our presentation. We're happy to answer questions that you have.
All right, questions, comments, or discussion?
I go back to this one.
So if it's a guideline, there isn't any requirement that a developer would have to do it, right?
It's voluntary.
Okay. I got to ask you a question before I comment. I want to make sure I'm okay on legal grounds. I'm assuming since the Park Place Crossing proposal is over and done with, that I'm okay to refer to Planning Commission discussions about that?
There is an application in-house,
There's,
but it's an expedited.
it's an expedited land division that won't come to you.
Yeah, it won't come to the commission if it's appealed.
Okay, well, I'm talking about the
The old
original,
one.
the old one.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So this came up when I was on the Planning Commission related to that development. And in particular, the Trailview subdivision next door, which is local streets. And because of the fact there wasn't the connection to Holly Lane, and even the connection up to Holcomb wasn't perfect because they were missing a piece of property, the increase in traffic on the local streets in Trailview, I mean, it wasn't going to double, it was going to be a massive increase. And as a planning commission, we didn't have any standard to look at to protect those neighbors from turning that local street certainly into a collector with the amount of traffic that it was going to have to take. So that's for me, that's how that all started, was why don't we have a standard for a local street in particular? Because a local street it's a lot more than a street. It's, you know, the basketball hoops are in the street and everything else. It's, so that's what brought it up. Now, in the meantime, the legislature has kind of changed the rules. And, you know, where all that's going to land, who knows? But us putting restrictions on housing I know is going to be a lot more difficult now than it might have been. So, yeah, I don't have any great answers. It bothers me that we don't have a way to protect an existing neighborhood. And maybe that's a one-off. And there'd never be another situation where a giant subdivision is on the outside of a small one, you know, and there's only one way out. But it might happen to us again. And it would be nice if we had some sort of protection for those existing neighbors. So,
would traffic calming be the protection, or are you thinking a denial of an application?
I think if the volume was high enough, that some other sort of mitigation other than traffic calming or denial ought to be a possibility. And I don't know where the right number is, because I know we need housing, and I'm not saying that we want to throw up a lot of roadblocks, but there's also a livability question when the traffic on when a local street is, I don't know, 1,000 cars now, and it's going to be 8,000 all of a sudden.
Well, so the only thing, a couple of things about that, and I am saying this not to defend that application at all, but I don't remember that we studied the volume on the local street. We studied the congestion at intersections, and so we knew what that looked like. And the other piece is there was a collector they were supposed to use, which would have been Holly Lane, right, or what functioned in the interim. So I think in that, if we were to have something like that come again, where the timing of putting in the roads wasn't quite lining up with the volume, we could look at some of the mitigation that we came up with was either kind of phasing it in terms of like what roads would open when. Mm-hmm. So that's one mitigation measure. It's not really traffic calming or decreasing the volume, but it was a way to direct it. Maybe that goes under traffic diversion. And if there was a standard or a guideline which we were able to come up with, then we could have said, like, okay, here's your secondary route. But that would all depend on the threshold that we came up with. So,
wasn't one of the things that you saw with other jurisdictions was that when they put in a number, like, typically wasn't being hit?
Right. Yeah, I think that's
what. A perception versus a reality. So without going back and seeing the trip count, right? Would it still be, even though it doubled, let's say, would it still be in the local street allowance? You know what I mean? Like, the trick's gonna be setting that number, right?
Sure.
Because I hate to be in a situation where it's like we come up with this number of trips, but like the intersection doesn't fail, right? So there's not that much volume that it causes a failing intersection, but we're gonna have a failing capacity. It's a new concept. I think we'd have to think through as to what those triggers might be and what they can.
And that would be the tricky part. Is we had a sewer moratorium. You could tell when that's at capacity, right? But how do you measure a street? Does 10 more cars you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't
Put it
turn to
over.
gridlock instantly.
Right.
It just gets progressively worse.
The Park Place local volume, I think, was higher than any of the local volumes. So I think that is a unique situation, but I think 1,200 or 1,600 FRC types, those are pretty big. And the ones from the jurisdiction, Westland was one that was like, we don't have them. And some situations it would have been nice to have the guideline because these projects are all clearly under that for the ones wishing to have it. I think for the land use planning piece, and when you have a standard but you don't allow an alternative analysis to show that there's no other way you can do development without connecting and an opportunity to mitigation. I think what Carrie is saying, we put ourselves in a precarious place where we are denying or trip capping a residential project because we did not allow them to show that this is the only alternative and mitigation is an option, because we do have an obligation to allow areas to develop to their zoning and develop to their permitted uses, right? And especially, how we use these guidelines for type 3 and 4 decisions, so planning commission, conditional uses, or master plans, or zone changes, and using that guideline in a finding compared to a type 2 subdivision application, where you're doing clear and objective standards. I think there's a variation about that. And so, we're always thinking the bread and butter is how would this relate to a clear and objective type 2 subdivision? Because I think that's where, if we don't allow the city and an applicant to look at, have they done their alternatives analysis and have they provided proportional mitigation? If we don't allow that, that's where I think the city puts himself into some legal problems.
And I would add that traffic calming tends to fix existing problems. Traffic calming implementation is hard to place in areas that you're projecting a problem, because the problem may or may not come to fruition, and then it's some added infrastructure that they're often used to remedy a problem that has occurred over time. Whereas something like trip capping, you know how much traffic is going to come to an intersection, and so you can say, this is the most that's allowed. But yeah, it's going to be hard to do traffic calming to prevent a problem. You're usually solving the problem with traffic calming. I think, to your question, Commissioner Mitchell, I think Park Place to some degree is a bit unique, because normally we always say you should start at the bottom, whether it's sewer or road, and go up. That one has the opposite reason because of where the infrastructure is. And so it has a unique, way to develop up there. I don't know of other areas in the city that we're going to have that type of situation. So it's challenging.
Frank?
So I agree with everything Commissioner Mitchell said. And traffic calming seems like a reactive measure as opposed to trying to solve the problem before it develops. I mean, the question is, when does a local street become a collector? And experience has shown that if you make voluntary compliance, builders don't spend money they don't have to spend money on. And that's a fact of life. So I lean more towards the codifying and combining it with the TSP. I'd like to get ahead of it. And I think, when the only access through something is what was formerly a local neighborhood street and now becomes something else because there is no really good access. And yeah, maybe that'll never happen again, Commissioner, but the truth is it could very well happen easily. Mm-hmm. As the UGB expands and we put larger developments next to existing neighborhoods, yeah, it could happen. So I'm in favor of not making it voluntary and making it a requirement.
Adam, did you have anything?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I tend to agree. I'm falling a little bit in the middle here, because if we're going to do something, I'm not really interested in the voluntary guidelines, because I'm not apt to believe that a developer is going to see that and think, oh, that really is for the best use of this neighborhood, so why don't we expend this extra money? So I have a hard time saying that that's going to happen and that we're going to see results. But at the same time, going in the other direction, wanting to see something that is enforceable, I want to balance that with the fact that we need something that's enforceable and also legal for us to do. And so that's where I have a really hard time is from hearing this presentation, how we make it clear and objective, I don't know. But if we're going to go down, if we're going to expend effort and staff time to do something, then that is the direction I would prefer to go rather than just a suggestion is where I am. Even though I still have concerns over potential litigation and how that could get in the way of housing production that people are going to inevitably raise, that I think this is still something that's worthwhile, especially as we head into the next TSP update in the next year or so.
I do wonder if it would be something that we incorporate into the TSP, because I could imagine a situation where we try to identify, like, do we know where we have cut through traffic? Let's say, right, where these type of measures would be helpful, right? And then from that, hopefully becomes some standard, right? So it's like, can we come up with something that addresses existing conditions, but then future ones that could be similar to an existing condition, right? So do we have collectors or an arterial that see a high percentage of a cut-through traffic on a local that exists today, right? That can kind of become, okay, this is what this looks like, right? Relative to a local street next to it that may have, a quarter of the volume. Just trying to think of, because it's, I mean, I can't imagine this, we want this on every local street in the city, right? I don't think it's necessary in every local street in the city, right? It's like trying to identify where these situations exist. Because I can think of communities I drive through where, a pretty aggressive signage and street calming measures have been put in to really try to prevent the cut-through traffic that probably was in response, right, to getting around an intersection or whatever the reason may be, right?
But you'll know too, to your point, you'll know where your growth areas are.
Exactly.
Right, we know where the urban growth boundary's been expanded. We have adopted zoning, but we didn't in our TSP evaluate what the impact of connecting that growth area into our existing road, local street infrastructure was. So we just picked to study those areas as part of the TSP and put in some standards to allow that transition to happen in a more thoughtful way. That would be easier than going and inventorying the traffic volumes on every local street in the city as part of a TSP update.
I feel that measuring intersections alone is a failed approach, that you have to measure traffic through areas like we talked about through local, and that's easily done. You see it all the time. I also feel that in a community where we have a valuable resource, a commodity called land, I think we should shift this burden to those who want to develop and gain profit from it, rather than subsequently down the road absorb costs in correcting a situation that's been created.
Do we have a direction, or we're all kind of, I agree with what has been said. So I think we're all kind of somewhere in the middle.
Is this put in the TSP as part of the plan? Is it put in the TSP and try to do something sooner through the budget process and try and come up with a pilot somewhere? Because we're kind of starting from scratch here. Mm-hmm. If we're going to try and codify something that's going to be utilized in land use.
What approach would make it a criteria for approval?
Well, I think you got to get the data to be able to justify whatever standard you're going to put in place if we're going to use it as a standard in a land use subdivision or land use application, whether that be residential or commercial. Which means, I mean, ideally, it would probably come out of the work that's going to go into the TSP, right? Because there you're going to be looking at traffic counts, you're going to be looking at volumes, you're going to be looking at street classifications, right? This becomes another input that gets measured and comes up with a, at X, or when, if we know X amount of trips are gonna go through an existing neighborhood because of development in this urban growth boundary, then, you're gonna need, whatever the traffic calming measures are gonna be, or traffic diversion measures are gonna be, right? Are we gonna, I'm not sure what that looks like, to be honest. I think that's why we would go through that process, is to kind of, because I don't think traffic humps are not going to be the answer in every situation, right? You're going to probably utilize curb bump outs, you're going to utilize roundabouts, you're going to utilize probably signage, right? It's probably going to be a little bit context driven.
If you take an example like Park Place, like you were talking about, and you put out your pressure readers and you took flow through the local streets, and then you knew, by virtue of access and egress, and you knew that you're going to put X number of units in that new development, 400, and then you take a percentage of how many people are going to have to use this. I mean, at some point, you should be able to predict what your flow is going to be in comparison to what it is. But first, you have to have a baseline of what it is, and that happens before. That needs to be studied beforehand. And I think we have the wherewithal to do that, do we not?
Yeah, I think the variable, like in the Park Place example, was the one tax lot that wasn't annexed, which was where the collector was going to connect to Holcomb, right? That's why it was kind of this collector up to a temporary local connection to Holcomb, right? I mean, if that land was available, the collector would have been blown through. I don't know how that changes the trip distribution, right? I would think most people are going to want to use the more direct route with the least amount of turns. But you're still going to get some that are going to use the local. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a statistical guesstimate, right? But yeah, we can certainly do that. But like I said, the wild card is, you make this assumption this road's going to be built. If a piece of it's not, the assumption's not good anymore, right?
Couple of quick questions, I think they're quick. So, when a developer does the traffic impact analysis, the level of service for the intersections is based on traffic counts, right? And if the traffic count is this is the level of service. And if it's going to go up to here, and that level of service gets worse, then that kicks in mitigation.
Correct.
So I suppose it's way too simple to say, why don't we have a level of service matrix for local streets?
Because I guess we have roadway classification numbers, right?
Right.
Like if you have this much volume, it should be this size street. But typically our issues of capacity are not in the street, it's at the intersections. So that's what
until you get in a weird situation like Park Place, where the intersection is 2 miles down the road, and you're not measuring any of the impact in between.
Well, part of that is because it's measured by delay. So the level of service is how much delay is happening at the intersection. So that's how you can tell if it's going from A to B to C. And then the other piece is that volume to capacity, which is kind of the same thing. It's like how much delay, like how many cycles do you have to wait through before it moves. So that's how that congestion gets measured there, rather than the volume, which is just...
Well, it seems to me that it's your volume, your street capacity that you're talking about is going to be a raw volume. It will be a number of cars, but it will also be the speed that they're going, right? The speed those cars are going.
Yeah.
And so that's going to create a ratio analysis. Like you could say, if you increase the number of cars by 50%, Anything over 50% of whatever that baseline is, you have to do something, right? Or 75%. But then you're gonna wanna look at the speed too. And so you're gonna say something, if you increase the number and the speed by some percentage, then you have to do something. Like that's the kind of clear and objective threshold you would need to sort of make it like the level of service that we have at intersections that works on delay.
And is it, like for intersections, we look at AM and PM peak, right? Because that's your highest demand, right? So right now, I bet you it'd be hard pressed to find an intersection in Oregon City that's not performing at an A at this time of night.
Sure.
Right? So when are you
gonna
measure how many cars are going by, right? So if for 30 minutes from 8:30 to 9 a.m., that's how we look at. We don't measure it over the day.
Right.
We measure it during 30 to 1 hour increments.
Yeah.
At the highest peak, right? 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. and whatever, 3 to 6, whatever. Who knows what it is now? 3 to 8. Nobody's looking at it at midnight because there's no point.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that plays into this a little bit too.
What hours are you gonna look at?
What hours, or is it just a total for the day? Right. And if, and I'm being completely facetious here, right? We all live on the street, right? Now I got my 3 or 4 kids, and now we all have cars, so now the number of trips on that street have gone up, 4 per day per car by 16 for the one household. Like, do we capture that? I mean, there's just some, what are we trying to do, right? Are we trying to provide safety? Are we trying to provide diversion? It might be different on different streets, right? I think we just got to be specific about what we're trying to accomplish. Just because I think, there could be unintended consequences as home ownership changed even in an existing community, in existing homes. What do we do then, right? So it's an interesting measurement to think of, like, how would we measure it? Like, what's going to be the trigger, right? Is it truly the total per day over a 24-hour period?
No.
So then you're looking at volume for a specific time.
And who selects those time periods?
How did they come up with the AM and PM peak? What typically is IT?
So AM and PM peak are based on, they do counts for the entire 24-hour period, and then they look at a statistical analysis to say,
Here's the highest time.
Yeah, and they'll do it usually over anywhere from 5 to 10 days, and then they look at what was the average of each day, and then that's how they come up with, on average, over that measured time, here's where the peak hours were.
Because there you're trying to get as much of the peak into the intersection that you're measuring for the delay.
Yep.
Right? Here you'd be measuring number of trips utilizing a street.
I would expect the trips would be similar to the intersection peak hours.
Yeah.
Should be similar.
But maybe you would be, if you're looking at livability and times when children are playing, maybe you'd move your peak hours to 3 to 5 rather than 4 to 6.
That's true.
Because you'd want.
Yep.
And one thing that Dana brought up is a little bit I spoke with when I talked to other communities and learning about our 2013 TSP is some of the answers may be that if there are more daily trips than we anticipated, then through this TSP, those local streets may not be local streets anymore because they're just not acting as a local street. They're acting as a neighborhood, even though we didn't maybe even plan them to be local streets. They just de facto are acting as neighborhood commercials and neighborhood collectors. So, we will learn things, and that'll be new information from how we see our roads.
So I think that's, it's kind of like what are we trying to accomplish, right? Is it safety? Is it slowing down speed? And then is it stopping cut through traffic, right? Like, is it one of those?
Yeah,
is it all of those? Or is it depend context specific, right? And then that would probably help drive like what becomes a a CIP list, or at least the targeted areas that are either in response to existing condition or try to predict a future condition based on future growth.
Well, and so Carrie, if we have guidelines in the TSP, can we not have a development incorporate that into their impact study, their traffic impact study, as part of what they look at?
You can ask them, but they
we
don't
can't
have to do
require
it. We can't regulate through the TSP things that aren't mandated substantive standards in the code.
Right, which is why
That's
the
why
word
they have to be
guideline is
standard.
problematical.
They have to be standards and criteria
Unless
in
it
the
became
code.
like our program, right, then we would use our guidelines to make decisions on capital, public spent money.
Well, I think that's another question of what you all want to see. Do you want this for new development specifically, or do you want it for existing development, or is it both? Because that may change the way we look at things as well. Like if we're just looking at kind of the edges, these UGB growth areas, and we're just looking at new development, then we're not having to think about like a capital program yet. We're just thinking about how do we manage this new development that's coming in.
See, I would start with new. And the situation that presents itself is when you have a limited number of alternative options to get in and out of an area. That's to me, that becomes a pretty easy calculation. I mean, if you've got 400 homes and you've got 2 roads, that's different than if you have 400 homes and you got 8 different points of access. Yeah. So those things present themselves, and they should be apparent to staff. That's where I want to apply this type of criteria. Ms. Richter is right on about the calculation is not only number of trips, but speed, the two together. And that's going to be impacted when you got backup. Say you're trying to get onto Holcomb and all of a sudden you're backed way up. That's a whole different, that's the impact on the intersection. I really feel we need to start with it. The reactive point, as has been brought up, is that's for existing neighborhoods. I mean, what can you do in existing neighborhoods? But this approach is for new development, and I think we need to take it.
Okay, so I think what we could do, we'll have to put our heads around it a little bit, but if we go back and look at our growth areas, which are concept plan areas, right? Park Place, Thimble Creek, South End, mostly those 3 areas as locations. We'll have to probably work with Rhea, our traffic engineer, for kind of the math, right? Like how are we going to identify the times and what are the thresholds going to be? And if whatever we bring back is going to have to be twofold, because I think we'll have to have your policy guidance that goes into like a TSP amendment that feeds into a standard. Because the standard could probably say, if we have it in the code, comply with the TSP. It's got to be clear. Okay, I'm trying. So anyway, we'll have to kind of put our heads together around what those next steps look like. But I think we've got your direction. Yes? Do we have?
I think so. Adam, anything else?
And you want to do this sooner than the TSP update?
Right, that's a good question, or with the TSP update.
Do we have a time frame on that?
Well, you were going to ask that.
We do not. We were hoping to be underway soon, but the grant process that allows us to fund those TSP updates has been a bit delayed on the state side, and so we are applying for the next round of grants, and hopefully we get them, and then that will allow us to go ahead. So maybe late 2025 is the earliest that we'd be available to do it, but it may take a little longer depending on the grant cycle.
And the process would take how long?
A TSP update takes anywhere from 1 to 2 years, depending depending on how robust our update is.
How do you generate a requirement versus a suggestion? Which approach does that? The TSP does not, correct?
What the TSP does is it identifies the classifications of roads and it plans for growth, right? It says, you know, we're gonna have growth here and here are the roads we need, and it would make sense that there's a chapter in the TSP that says, and here are the traffic calming measures to deal with new growth, right? That's how those things are generally built. If you wanna do it faster than that, we're gonna have to kind of do the analysis of what the number ought to be, and then we'll either have to do a more surgical amendment to the TSP in order to give us the foundation for the standard, or we're just gonna do a standard. Which we can do either. You know, the problem with just doing a standard is then we don't have the
Supporting data.
supporting data, the planning that goes behind the standard. And the reality is, I think even if you really wanted to prioritize this, it would be the end of 2025 before we actually got something ready for, adopted in the code. I mean, this is just not something we can just write up in a couple of months. It's gonna take some study of the underdeveloped areas and what kind of growth we can expect in those areas that have zoning that is not developed, right? Because we're talking about situations where we're bringing in 400 homes, right? And you know, yes, we had the benefit of the Park Place traffic study, but that doesn't cover all of Park Place, for example. It's only, what, half of the North Village, or a third, 3/4 of the North Village? So we don't have any traffic data of how much traffic the South Park would build. So, I mean, I just think it's not very realistic to think that we could, I mean, we may not be able to do it any sooner than Josh's TSP.
So what is the constraint? Is it funding? Is it staffing?
I mean, some of it is just a time thing. I mean, if not to speak for you guys, but I mean, we would need to do things like traffic studies. We would need to do, start looking at data around the region of what our numerical data means and how to analyze it. But this is an unknown, and we'd want to make sure we didn't just come up with it lightly. We want to make sure we try and use every engineering tactic we can of how to analyze it, how to use it, and determine where's our study areas. And there is a bit of a funding question. We would need consultant assistance with this to do it. So it would just take time from all the processes of contracting and in the field analysis and data collection.
Yeah, to me, the question is it funding or staffing or a combination of both? And the budget process is going to come up here shortly. Yeah. Maybe that ought to be a proposal that if you choose to do this, City Commission, in the absence of a grant, this is what it's going to cost you. And that should be a discussion at budget.
I agree, because there is no funding identified right now with, 7 months left in the fiscal year.
Right.
As well as, we're trying to hire a traffic engineer, and so I think it's both.
I mean, if your goal is...
In terms of a financial, that we'd have to identify funding, and then there is a staffing, we'd have to deal with staffing and someone to project manage a consultant team to do all collect the data, analyze the data, come up with something that's justifiable, that can then be codified.
To me, as project management, if your goal is to expedite the conclusion of something like this, you identify the constraints and you ask yourself, what does it take to overcome them? And that's why I say it could be a budgetary process.
That makes sense.
Adam?
Thank you. I would prefer that we do this in conjunction with the TSP update, because the way I see it is that we're either going to hire 2 different consultants to do very similar work, or we're going to hire 1 consultant to do just a little more in-depth work to give us the data that we need in order to do this correctly. Because the other thing that we might run into is the fact that in the absence of that TSP data, how confident will we be that it will meet that clear and objective standard with that limited amount of information that we get if we choose to do it separately from the TSP, whereas going along with the TSP and that being an ancillary document to our highest documents and being able to back that up with a lot of that priority that comes with that document, I think will help us if there are any legal questions about whether the data is something that can be trusted when it comes to developers who may want to challenge the legality of that regulation.
Okay.
And just to combine Commissioner Marl's comment and Commissioner O'Donnell's comment, these grants for TSPs do have maximum amounts that at some point they'll only give us so much money to do our updates. But that doesn't mean that we can't add our own supplementary amount during the budget process to add to that to make it an even more robust project. It's just a matter of deciding how big is our update going to be.
All right.
To me, the end result of the product is it's not going to be optional. This is what's going to be needed
Right.
to move forward with the development.
Right.
So is this a goal-setting budget, we apply for a grant TSP, or is this a standalone project that we come back and have a discussion about budgeting and
Well,
staffing?
There's going to be a lot of data collection involved, right? Before you would ever get to something you could add to the TSP. So maybe the data collection part of it is a separate budgeted process that happens before the TSP so that we have the data when we do the TSP.
Yeah, if it's a sequential
Right.
type thing, what do you need to get started? Data collection.
Right.
Right, so I think that what that would look like is working with DKS, our consulting traffic engineer, to start that background work. And I guess the question is, are we still focusing on these growth areas rather than the whole city? Is that what?
That's kind of what I heard, was the growth areas.
Focus on new.
New development.
Yeah.
Right.
So, okay, so that's sounding like something that comes up in the budget process then?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna have some discussions with our consultant, maybe on scoping, but we're really gonna focus on having something prepared to discuss during the goal setting and budget process.
Yeah.
We're not gonna start anything, no expectation to bring anything back, correct?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
I guess because I think the concern would be, since we are kind of blazing new trail, if we don't have solid data behind it, we're going to end up in court over where did you come up with these goofy numbers?
Right on.
Okay.
Well, and you need to make it work, it needs to work.
Yeah, right. Both ways.
It needs to allow development to occur, and it needs to protect neighborhoods.
Exactly.
And we can't just pull numbers out.
Right.
Okay. Good. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah, so we will get with DKS and get a scope and a budget that we can bring to the goal setting. Okay,
Sounds good.
okay,
All right, thank you.
okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
That brings us to 3B, K-9 Retirement Funds discussion, and our chief, Sean Davis.
Sure. Sorry, I was kind of crashing in.
And once again, Carrie, when I started reading your document, I said, okay, how far will it go before I see Dolan versus City of Tigard?
I waited till the second page, bottom of the second page.
Yeah, I knew it was going to be there.
All right, go for it.
All right, Good evening. As you know, on September 18th, a member of the public provided public comment, requested the commission allocate funds for a canine retirement fund. And the commission asked staff to bring this topic back to our work session. So in the staff report, I provided a detail, and I was going to go over the history of our canine program, just so you guys have some context. Our first canine was received in December of 2003 at Titus, and at that time there was no allocated funds, and so all the funding had to be raised through donations, community donations, and that paid for everything: veterinary care, kennel, dog, all the supplies. In 2008, because of their success, we got another canine, Canine Jaeger. That was my canine, and much of that funding was also done through donations. Our third canine, Canine Flint, he was purchased through budgeted funds, and since then all canines and associated costs have been through the budgeted. Currently, we have 2 canines on patrol, 1 in training to replace Canine Slate, who will retire at the end of this year, and we have 1 narcotics canine. Currently, when a canine is active, the handler is compensated according to the collective bargaining agreement, and all associated costs, including food, equipment, training, veterinary care, everything's paid for through the department. Interestingly, the veterinarian that we use, they donate all their time and costs, and so the department only has to pay for the costs of like medicine or shots or that kind of stuff, or any care there. And that also, when a canine retires, that is carried over to the canine when they're retired. So when a canine retires, the handler is offered to receive the canine. They don't have to, but since every canine's been retired, every handler has built that bond and has accepted that, with understanding that all responsible costs are at the responsibility of the handler. In 2018, after Canine Flint retired, they began selling canine stuffed animals as a fundraiser to assist with supporting retired canines. All those proceeds go to a dedicated fund that's at a 501c3, and the handlers submit receipts for their reimbursed costs. There's also a donation page where people can also donate money for that. This all kind of came forward to the public on August 5th when a member of the public made a presentation to the CIC, and on a recommendation that the city create a retirement fund. CIC really didn't have any authority, and so they kind of suggested they come to the city commission. So I did some research because this is kind of what we do, so I wanted to see what other departments do. So I reached out to the Oregon Association of Chiefs of Police, and they have a forum on there where chiefs can pose questions, and I reached out to posed a question. If anyone has anything, I'd like to get any information. To this date, no one's responded. I reached out to the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office. They're the largest canine, they probably have the largest canines and the most canines retired in the county, and they don't have any retirement fund. They use a nonprofit that was created. I don't know who created that. It's called Friends of Clackamas County Canine, and all the funds there go to the retirement canines. I did meet with a member of the public just to discuss what was kind of brought to the CIC. We had a very good discussion. I did present what I had learned so far, and some concerns that I had potentially with the department holding on to money and then reimbursing a handler once a canine's retired. I have since reached out to Portland Police Bureau. They do not have a canine retirement fund. They're undoubtedly the largest canine group in the state and probably have the most canines. They did tell me about, and I did hear about this, but I wasn't super familiar, so I passed around House Bill 2304. Sorry, Commissioner Marl. But in 2023, this was proposed, and it's basically a bill that was proposed to come up with funding for canines once they retire. And it's the state would allocate funds, and it was gaining traction. It went through and got to the Ways and Means Committee, and and it stayed there when they went to adjournment. So I think there is some traction there. But I passed that around so you can see that could likely become forward again in the future, because I think the Oregon Police Canine Association was working with this gentleman that proposed this to the representative. So I'm here to have a discussion with you guys about that. If you guys have any questions.
I think you did some good work there, Chief, gathering that information.
Thanks.
More discussion or comments?
Well, apparently everybody's waiting.
I did bring up that, in my opinion, a 501c3 or some sort of foundation would be probably the proper way to raise money, right? I think our handlers are the current ones raising that right now. They're pretty tired of raising money, right? They're going out there, they're doing it because they know at some point their canines are going to probably have some care. I think a foundation could get more swag, could raise money, could go out there and do shirts. I see them at the different events. I went to the safety fair over at Danielson's earlier this year, and their foundation was there raising money. So I think that could be probably the likely solution. That would be a compromise to everything, but that's why I'm here to have a discussion.
I had to educate myself on this, having worked among canines, not being a canine officer myself, understanding the relationship between the handler and the canine. I even went back and looked at the military, who sadly, they just consider the canine equipment. And there was a law in 2000, they passed a law called Robbie's Law, which did away with euthanasia for their military dogs. So that's not, euthanasia is not what's happening.
Correct.
I mean, the options that are before us, you know, the nonprofit is an excellent option. Usually, as you spoke, the handler does adopt the dog. And the options are, if the handler doesn't want to adopt the dog, perhaps the dog gets handed off to another officer who's going to continue its service. The dogs themselves are, I think they're usually between 1 and 9 years old, and from what I see, they have an average of 6 to 8 years of service. And it said, if I looked up the lifespan of a German Shepherd, it is somewhere between 11 and 13 years. I just feel like, I think the nonprofit option is a good one. The GoFundMe is a good one. There's a lot of support for this in the community. I'm certainly not in favor of the police department handling direct adoptions to the general public, because there are adoption agencies that will do this for you if you so wish. And I want to put somebody in that line. I know the dogs, I'm not wanting to equate our dogs to a military dog, but they can have experiences that actually generate PTSD in the animal. And I would rather, if the handler doesn't keep them or it goes to another officer, I'd rather utilize an adoption agency to put them in the flow to eliminate any responsibility for anything that could potentially happen after adoption. And I don't want to cast a negative light on that. I guess the way I really feel about it is, I mean, this is an open-ended for us to get into it when I don't think we need to, especially if this were to pass and if you already have the existing support mechanisms financially and people really want to support it. You know, I don't want to write a blank check because the costs you can incur long term, whether it be hip dysplasia or cancer treatments or whatever. I just feel like we have a good system in place with a lot of support and a lot of mechanisms for funding. And the 501c3 is a great option, and the multitude, and there are multiple adoption agencies. I think we're good where we're at. And I think the investigation you did and gathering is sufficient to make me feel comfortable with that.
Adam or Mike?
Well, I guess first off, I was surprised to find out that it isn't common. I mean, I would have expected that other agencies are already taking care of this for retired dogs. And I'm surprised that they're not. I do see a difference between kind of the routine care because, I mean, they do become a pet for the officer. And everybody that has a pet knows that pets cost some money. So I'm not too worried about the routine kind of things, but what these dogs go through, protecting their handler and protecting all of us and tracking down the bad guy, you know, they're exposed to chemicals, who knows what all, and I'm sure that they have a higher incidence of orthopedic kind of problems, and I know how much all that costs from sad experience with a dog. So I guess those major medical kind of expenses, I would like to see us cover, and I'm surprised that it doesn't already happen. I didn't have time to investigate it further, but there are a couple of pet insurance companies that at least, you know, on their website say that we provide reduced rates for medical insurance, major medical insurance for retired canine officers, and I think that's something we ought to look into, and that would take the unpredictable expense out of it if we were to cover the cost of insurance for major situations. And, you know, and I get the 501c3 thing also, but maybe I'm just soft-hearted because I'm a soft-hearted dog guy. But to me, everything that those dogs do for us when they're active, that should not become a burden on that officer. The suicide rate among veterinarians is extremely high because on a daily basis, they see animals that they have to put down because people can't afford to get the treatment that the dog needs. And to put one of our officers in a position that they have to make that kind of a decision over the dog that served us for years, that just doesn't sit right with me. So I don't want to close the door on us finding a way to handle those major expenses without some further investigation of what could be done.
Adam?
Thank you. Chief, could you just go a little bit more in depth, recognizing that a handler continuing to care for their canine, that being a choice, if they chose not to, what would be the process for the department in the way of adoption or whatever that may be?
Yeah, we haven't had one. I think everyone's continued to keep their canine. Usually when they retire, for the most part, they're towards their end of their life. Not necessarily. Sometimes they live a couple years, but generally we get a canine from 1 to 3 to 4 years old, and then they work for 6 to 8 years generally. Some have more problems than others, but a couple of our canines after retirement, they weren't a pet for very long, and then like my canine was almost 2 years. So if that would, I think we would, we haven't had that option, so I would probably lean towards asking anyone at the department if they want to adopt the dog. If not, then there are plenty of rescue organizations out there and other 501c3s that will adopt dogs. There's a lot of, especially Malinois rescue out there, and a lot of those, I've looked at dogs too. I consider getting another one as just a pet, and that was one of the places I went to, and some of those are service-related dogs. So that's what I would look at doing.
Okay, so to be clear, euthanasia is not at all at any part of this when the officer makes the choice to continue caring for the pet or not. That is not a part of the equation.
Not unless the canine was to that point.
Okay.
That was, yeah.
I think that's...
If it's still going to be a pet and working or living at home, that is not an option. I would not consider that.
And I guess that's kind of what makes the difference for me, is that this is a choice on the part of the handler of whether they would like to do this. And I'm glad to know that as, you know, they've become very integrated into these officers' lives, and I think that's probably the best way for it to happen. But I think when we consider the fact that it is in fact a choice, that really affects my decision-making on this. I think I appreciated the background about the fact that we do pay for those services while they are working for the department, and that there is also a premium pay as well as part of the CBA. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, yes.
So not only when they are in service are we covering that, but we also pay additionally. So I think that, combined with the fact that looking at other jurisdictions and that this just isn't something that's done, at least at a widespread level, I think raises questions and red flags for me in terms of, because I get what Commissioner Mitchell is saying about limiting it to certain instances, but I think one could find themselves in a gray area trying to determine whether in fact a certain ailment can be attributable to a dog's service or a dog's just normal progression of life. And so that's where I have a hard time trying to make that distinction. So I appreciated hearing from our citizens. I was at that CIC meeting, and then of course when we got the letter at our city commission meeting a couple months ago, and I appreciated hearing that. And what I didn't hear, if we were to move forward with this, is what people think that we should be cutting if we were to move forward with that, cutting from the police budget. Would we then look at cutting the premium pay that we give to the canine officers? Of course, that would be part of the collective bargaining. But the point that I'm trying to make is that if we do move forward with this, it's going to result in a net negative somewhere else. And it may just end up being a reduction in some of the services that we already do provide to our canine officers and our canines. So that's where I am now. I think that expanding upon the 501c3 is what I would be leaning toward right now for all of those reasons.
Well, I guess I'm mixed a little bit. I'm not someone who is a big fan of dogs, but I do feel like, these are police officers, and I think the city, clearly the city is doing more in this regard than other cities have ever done. Probably. I think, this does have some promise. This bill has some promise. However, we don't know if that'll happen at one point or another. I'm not one to look at other cities and say, well, no one else is doing this. That's what our city is about, is doing things that no other city's done and trying it. So I would love to see us be able to support, I'm not saying, fund it all one way or another, but an organization hasn't come to fruition really that has taken that on yet, and that takes people to do it. Is that something that there's an interest out there in the community to have that done? Is the city able to somehow find, if we can't budget a whole program, is there a way for the city to continue to support that or contribute to it or find grant money to do that? I feel like even if a police officer takes on that, commitment and know that they're doing it, they still deserve help for that. And the canine officers themselves, I think, deserve that. So I guess I'm kind of on the fence a little bit, but I think we could, do more to support that. I don't know, we normally don't take comment at work sessions, but I know there's at least one person or two, maybe two people that, or maybe more that might have comment on. I don't know. This came to us from citizens. There might be citizens in the audience, I guess, that I'm saying might have a comment on where we're talking about today. If the commission is open to just.
I usually look for expertise in comments.
I understand.
You know, I honestly feel like we're trying to solve a situation or a problem that's already solved.
Okay.
That funding is there in multiple ways. That adoption agencies are a multitude of adoption agencies. That we haven't had a problem in the past, and the relationship between handler and dog is of such a personal nature that the handler generally wants to continue it. I feel we're in search of a solution where there's not currently a problem. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I guess that's the only reason I would ask the public. The public brought it to us thinking there was a problem, and if that's true, then they wouldn't be here still asking that. So I guess
what's interesting to me is the thing was not driven internally from the police department itself.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I know. Direction?
Well, I don't want us to close the door tonight on investigating this further, on what it might cost, what insurance might cost. So, you know, I know we're not reaching any decisions because we're in a work session.
Right.
But
well, I mean, I guess in that sense, we leave the conversation where it is. At our next public meeting, if there's citizen comments still regarding this and feel that this commission somehow has missed something, they're more than welcome to let us know that, and we can reopen the conversation.
I'm not a lawyer, but there was one concern that I came up with, just when funds are being used, or say the department's holding on to funds, and then K-9's retired, and the handler says, I want to do this procedure. Who's the final decision maker on that, right? So that was, some of those things could be, because something might, I've seen it in nearby jurisdictions, right? Where something's very terminal, but someone wants to spend maybe an exorbitant amount of money.
Sure.
And is that the right choice? I don't know. I haven't been presented that choice, but that was one of the things. And I'm sure there's some other unintended consequences, or maybe some other legal issues that come about. Otherwise, I would think potentially some other agencies would be doing this. I don't know. So that was some stuff that I just brainstormed, and I went to the biggest agencies around us to see why they're not doing it or what they're doing. And so, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the holding on money and when something's retired or not being utilized by a department.
well, and to that, maybe funneling it through a 501c3 is the right thing to do, and the city provides a certain amount of support to that 501c3 to run the program. So, all right, I'd just like to keep talking about it.
I think, I just leave it as it is. We'll hear from the public or not if we move forward on it, or
And maybe there's a chance for our insider, Commissioner Marl, to find out if this bill has any chance of moving forward in the session coming up.
I'll do some digging, I guess, no pun intended. But one thing that I wanted to say is, to a point that Commissioner Smith made, I think it's absolutely well taken about not using the fact that other jurisdictions don't do something as a reason not to do something. I think where I take that is understanding that we're definitely not the first people who have thought about this.
Right.
And it's an understanding of why those jurisdictions did not go ahead with those in the first place is what gives me pause. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Agreed. Okay, I would just encourage the public to comment at another meeting if they felt like they didn't get a chance to do that tonight. All right, we are at communications update on city projects.
Yep, so thank you. Attached to the agenda was the update. So for the quiet zone, the survey crews have been out there performing field work and surveying the project area. Staff has been meeting with property owners, specifically Dutch Brothers, to try and address the concerns that they have about a potential driveway closure of one of their driveways, the one closest to the railroad tracks on 10th. So those are continuing ongoing discussions. Charter Park, staff continues to meet with property owners that have encroachments into the McLaughlin Promenade to review and explain the license agreement. We anticipate bringing this back to the Commission for direction in January, February of 2025. We've had a handful of property owners. One is we worked with and we removed the encroachment. A couple have signed, a couple have said they absolutely will not sign, and then there's a handful that are kind of on the fence, in between. So we will be bringing that to the commission to have a discussion about how they'd like to proceed with those encroachments. We met with staff from the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation to discuss Phase 2 of the Cayuse 5 Memorial. At this point, you may remember that we allocated approximately $150,000 to that project. We had about $37,000 left over after Phase 1. We're working with Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. They've been able to get some grant funding and raise some additional funds as well to move forward with the Phase 2. So at this point, we've started to work. We have an internal team that's going to begin. And we're going to run it like we did the first one in terms of going to the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee, going to Historic Review Board. It'll go through land use. We'll be handling all of that. We'll also be working with them to identify a contractor. But really at this point, right now it's going to be Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde and Confederate Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation. They're going to meet to make sure they're on the same page about what Phase 2 is before we take any additional steps at this time. So I anticipate that's going to take probably into the new year by the time they're able to get their cultural resource together, officers together from both nations. We've also talked about maybe doing a site visit just to kind of remind everybody what the terrain's like out there. So getting through the holidays here, it'll probably slow down a little bit, but I think we're in a good spot to move that project forward at the beginning of the new year. I forgot the mayor wasn't going to be here. On the courthouse committee, I know they met a couple of times on the disposition of the courthouse. I was anticipating that she'd be able to give an update on the next steps, because I am not exactly sure where they're at, other than I know they've met. I think the general feeling was that really the county wants to kind of move forward with selling the property. But once again, I think maybe probably best to have the mayor kind of give a more thorough update based on her involvement in that meeting, since I was not involved in those. And the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde has submitted their land use application to amend the adopted framework plan. The Planning Commission meeting is scheduled for January 27th on that proposed amendments.
All right, any questions on that updates? All right, any committee reports? I do not have any.
As for me, approaching the end of my years of service, there's things I want to get done, and I hope we do get them done. I believe that the DMO will happen, and I think there's going to be questions that need to be answered specifically about the amount of control the city commission wants to exercise over the DMO, and you guys will be party to that discussion. And I want to see the John Storm Dock commercial river traffic move forward. City staff has made 2 attempts to contact the State Marine Board with no response. Commissioner Mitchell has pointed out that agreement is long ago expired. At some point, you grab the bull by the horns and you move on. And I don't know when our next meeting is specifically of the Rivers Assets and Opportunities.
November 22nd, I think?
I think so, and that thing continues to gain momentum. And I would invite someone from the city to attend if they so wish. And other than that, I don't want to see the Cove water quality piece just be an ongoing study. We may have to extend it for a bit, But at some point, we don't want to study for the sake of studying. We want a solution. And that'll be carried forward by those who I've served with after I'm gone. That's just my thoughts about the future.
Was that meeting during what time is that?
It's November 22nd at 9 a.m. at River Shore.
And we continue to get more interest, and hopefully there's going to be some pretty impressive attendees if that comes to be.
Yep.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, I filled in for Commissioner Marl at the latest C4 meeting, and basically there were two presentations. One was on the housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy that we'll have to do, but according to the time frame, Oregon City will have to do our housing capacity analysis in 2027 and housing production strategy in 2028. But they did kind of a roundtable of, because there are some cities that have already gone through the process, some have started. A couple of them submitted to DLDC and it got turned down. So it's how am I going to say this? They're figuring out the process as they're using the process. They're trying to fix the bicycle as they're riding it down the street, kind of. And it was interesting, there was one gentleman who had been community development director in one city and then became city manager in a smaller city, and the two cities submitted essentially the same strategy, and one got approved and one got turned down. So whatever that means.
Glad we're not going first.
That's right. Somebody else plays that trail. And then the other presentation was on transportation and the funding package that might come up in the legislature, and that I don't remember the exact title of that transportation committee, but apparently they have 3 work groups going. One is concentrating on funding, one is concentrating on transit, and one is concentrating on finish what we started, or finish what was promised, which would include the 205 widening. So that was it.
Adam's meditating or something. Adam, do you have anything?
Well, it's just the talk of those work groups. I have to sit in on every single one of those for my job. And hearing more and more the fact that not only is ODOT asking for $1.8 billion per year, not per biennium, per year, just to get to their ideal service level in addition to the things that everyone else is asking for. It'll just be very interesting to see. The only communication I have is thank you to Commissioner Mitchell for filling in for me. I've been unable to attend C4 the last couple of times because I have actually been taking a class at PSU on transportation, and so that's been an interesting time for me, and it's going to be over here soon, and so I'll be able to relieve Commissioner Mitchell of his duties there, but just wanted to give a shout out and let you know that I appreciate it, so thank you.
So you're going to be bringing us our local street standard capacity, right? Is that going to be your thesis paper or something you can do?
All right.
Real quick, could you, not to put you on the spot, but we are, just so you, the commission's aware, there were new standards that came down from FEMA concerning the 100-year floodplain. So you may recall we're part of the National Flood Insurance Program. We go through certification. I think it's every year. Essentially, because of the standards we've put in for balance, cut, and fill requirements, with no increase in the floodplain, we get rated, and essentially that gets a lower insurance rate on our property owners in the floodplain. Also qualifies us for, if there's a flood, natural disaster, eligible for emergency funding, reimbursement that would happen. There was a lawsuit that started over a decade ago, and essentially saying that FEMA needed to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service, with NIMS. So out of that, are some new regulations that have come down that are interim, And essentially you had to either adopt the model ordinance that FEMA had put together, look at applicants by a permit by permit basis, so one-off every time they come in, or a moratorium. And we needed to provide that to FEMA by December 1st. And then they would continue with the rulemaking and we'd be adopting new standards again. Needless to say, most jurisdictions in Oregon are really struggling with this, the timing of it, the lack of clarity associated with it. We can't get through the land use process quick enough to meet their deadline that they put in. And there's unknowns related to the standards are not clear and objective. How are we going to apply that? So there's just all kinds of issues that have not been raised. Needless to say, we're going to amend our code to go to a permit by permit. So essentially, as an application comes in, we will review it and then issue a decision based on that. But we need to do code changes to our existing 1742 flood management overlay district to be able to apply these standards. So you'll be seeing that probably end of December if things go well, early January. We'll be bringing back those changes, but then we'll be continuing to work with the state and federal agencies to try to get a better understanding of exactly what is going to be implemented.
Just to add, so the issue is the Endangered Species Act. So the FEMA flood standards don't look at what the impact development has on endangered species. And so what FEMA is asking local governments to do is to require developers to evaluate the no net loss standard under the Endangered Species Act as part of development. Well, the no net loss standard is not clear and objective. And FEMA wrote a model code that they're encouraging local governments to adopt, and it's not clear and objective either. You analyze the quality and character of the habitat that you have out there and how your development will impact that habitat, and you propose mitigation. I mean, it's chock full of discretion. Our office's recommendation, having tracked this for the last 2 months or so and talking with other city attorneys and looking at what other cities are doing, there is no sort of good option out of this, but the least bad option is the permit by permit approach, because there isn't that much development within the floodplain. And having applicants provide the analysis as part of their proposal, and then us checking off that analysis happens, is more clear and objective than getting into the minutia of no net loss. So that's what we have recommended, understanding that this is an interim solution that is not perfect, but it will do to satisfy FEMA for the December 1st deadline. We're moving in the right direction. We know we're going to have to change it probably again by another deadline in July 1st, but that's what we've recommended.
And the reason we're pushing is that essentially the threat is that we would lose our insurance standing if we did not implement, as well as the ability to collect should we have a natural disaster. So it's pretty important that we do something. For example, I did think about Stimson, right? When I think about, we have water quality overlay district. We have stormwater standards that comply with DEQ standards. We have no net fill. We have 1 foot above the 100-year floodplain. We have storm drainage requirements that have to be put in place. We have landscaping. It's hard for me to envision how, Stimson being developed isn't a better condition than it is right now. So I think we just need to get through this process, wait for the litigation that I'm sure to come will happen. And, it'd be one thing if we had no standards in the floodplain. I feel pretty confident that we actually have really good standards in the floodplain. But if you do hear about or see anything on League of Oregon Cities, I think everyone is struggling with how to meet these very qualitative measurements in a clear and objective world that we now live in for land use. So, that's all the good news I got.
All right, anything else? All right, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Great.